Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison. Before we start, I wear hearing aids and that indicates I'm hard of hearing. Could I ask you maybe just to pitch your voice up a little? I'm very anxious to hear what you have to say, but that's also true of everyone else in the room, and it's quite a large space. Mr. McGregor.
Thanks, Miller. Mr Morrison, just before lunch we were discussing the procedures leading to the approval of Settlement Agreement 1 and the money moving from Scottish Government to NHS Lothian. Could you just explain from the point that NHS Lothian say we've reached an agreement in principle with the project company, what are the formal mechanisms for approval before the money flows to NHS Lothian?
So there's no real kind of standard approval processes for that, for a settlement agreement. So we basically modified the procedures we'd use for a business case for a capital investment. So the proposal came in from NHS Lothian. It was reviewed by principally colleagues in the health finance team. And then we determined that it was approvable. So a recommendation as chair of the capital investment group went to the Director General. And I think it was ultimately signed off by the Director of Finance, but I think that was because the Director General was on holiday that week. So she had delegated authority. So it just went through the normal process where the approval was given and confirmation that the funding would be available.
Okay. And the confirmation can come at Director General level. It doesn't have to be the Cabinet Secretary themselves that signs off on that. Yeah,
basically for all health capital projects, the delegation is with the Director General rather than the Minister.
Thank you. That deals with your involvement really in Settlement Agreement 1. I'd like to pick matters up on the 2nd of July 2019. You tell us in your witness statement that you become involved in the project at that time. Can you just explain what's happening on the 2nd of July?
So I got a phone call from John Connigan in the afternoon saying that he had just met with the Chair and Chief Executive of NHS Lothian, saying that they had identified a problem with the ventilation system and that not sure if immediately there was doubt as to whether the hospital could open as planned, which was in a matter of days. But clearly it was a significant problem, and that kind of set the scene for the next few days and weeks.
Okay. If I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, please, Volume 1, page 37. And it's the email towards the bottom. You see, this is an email sent by yourself on the 2nd of July at 4:53, saying, please find attached a short briefing regarding an emerging issue with the new Edinburgh Children's Hospital. There's a phone call scheduled with NHS Lothian at 5:30 p.m. and DG Health and Social Care may phone the Cabinet Secretary after that, depending on the outcome of that call. Now, over the page onto page 38, there's a briefing. Who produced this briefing?
So that would be NHS Lothian would have provided us with that, and I can't remember if I made any kind of changes to it, but my sense is that was I just took it straight from NHS Lothian, made no amendments whatsoever.
Okay. There's obviously discussion within this document about the air changes in particular, and if we just look to the final paragraph on page 38, you see it states, it should be noted that there is a zero rate of air change in critical care at the existing Royal Hospital for Sick Children. There are 19 critical care beds at RHSC. The new RHCYP has 24 critical care beds. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you just perhaps explain your thought process, what discussions are taking place in relation to the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence that 10 is the number of air changes set out within the guidance for critical care. But the old hospital at Sheens, they didn't have any mechanical ventilation, they didn't have any air changes an hour. So you have a system that's been designed and built with 4 air changes per hour. What were your concerns, if any, in relation to the safety of not complying with best practice guidance against a backdrop whereby Sheens didn't have any mechanical ventilation whatsoever?
So I suppose at that point, my knowledge of ventilation systems was pretty limited. So that I certainly was aware that perhaps not as early as in the second, but I think on the following day, when I met with colleagues from Health Facility Scotland, Health Protection Scotland and NHS Lothian to discuss like what the next stages are, that they kind of said that in the existing hospital, if you wanted any air changes, you opened a window type thing. So we were aware that the current facility was that it was not best practice. I suppose would be the best way of factoring that in or considering it. I don't recall too much kind of consideration of, well, 4 is better than 0, so is that good enough? It became pretty clear that within a couple of days of that note that the Cabinet Secretary had made a decision that 10-year changes is what we had to deliver, and I don't recall too many discussions after that decision had been made as to whether actually 4 would be good enough.
Thank you. If we could just look on still within the briefing note to page 40, please. You see that at page 40, bold heading 3 at the top, an interim solution has been put forward by Multiplex to increase current 4 air exchange rates. I won't read it all out, but there was a suggestion that some areas could be increased to 5.2, some could be increased to 7.1. Again, do you recall any discussion in terms of, well, we've got 4, possibly that can be increased to 5 or 7. Would 5 or 7 be good enough? Is there any discussions taking place around that?
No. I mean, at that point, it was really, we appreciated we had a problem and we needed to get some more information. And the meeting the following day was quite helpful in clarifying the position. But at no point were we, as you can see from the note, that there's no suggestion that we're even asking the Cabinet Secretary whether she would be content with less than the recommended air changes.
Because if we look towards the bottom, there's the bold heading 4 risk assessment, which states our lead infection control doctor, consultant microbiologist Dr. Donald Inverarity, advised that all air change rates are currently better than what we have today. Therefore, we'll be in an improved position. We would wish external advice from HFS/HPS. He felt they were best people to advise of risk running with less than 10. Do you see that?
Yes.
The inquiry hasn't seen any evidence to suggest that HFS, HPS come in or do any form of risk assessment. Is that your understanding? There's not any risk assessment done?
There was no formal risk assessment. And as I say, it was the following day when we met and we started, or more accurately, they started kind of considering how they could perhaps kind of address the problem.
Mm-hmm. We'll come on to address that in a minute, but really, you're someone who principally deals with finance as opposed to technical matters. And you'll be aware that in terms of settlement agreement 2, so settlement agreement 1, £10 million paid, there's millions of pounds that are paid under settlement agreement 2. Do you find it surprising, given so much public money, that there isn't a risk assessment being undertaken in terms of whether what's there, albeit it doesn't comply with best practice, was actually safe enough, or to put it another way, was so unsafe that it justified spending millions of pounds to rectify it and bring it up to best practice?
So while there wasn't a formal risk assessment undertaken, there was a consideration of what the next steps were, and there's no constraints as to what was required. There was a group of technical people that were considering the situation, thinking about the risk of things like, could we upgrade the ventilation within a live kind of patient environment. So while I would say that there was no formal production of a document, that that kind of view and risk was throughout that kind of subsequent conversation.
During the discussions that you had at this time, did you gain any appreciation of why is 10 the magic number? Why is 10 safe and you take risk if you deviate from 10? Was anyone able to give you an explanation for that?
No, but I didn't. I certainly didn't ask that question. Why 10 was the number, and I think over the kind of coming weeks that kind of as I spoke to people that had more experience in ventilation systems, I would kind of probe that question. But by then, obviously, we'd made a decision about what we were going to do in terms of delivering 10-year changes.
So the inquiry's heard directly from the Cabinet Secretary that she decided very quickly that the hospital doesn't comply with SHTM 0301. It doesn't provide 10-year changes per hour. It must comply. Do you find it strange that that decision is taken without a risk assessment being done in terms of the system as built?
So I suppose that one of the kind of key factors was we needed to make a decision quickly, because I can't remember the exact day when the move was supposed to happen, but it was a matter of days away. And in terms of planning for that move, I think that drove the necessity to make a speedy decision. If this had been identified, even 2-3 weeks earlier, and there was a wee bit more luxury of time, then it is possible we might have had to do that. But the decision was we need to make a decision quickly. It was felt that we couldn't open a hospital that was not compliant with our guidance. Therefore, the decision the Cabinet Secretary took was consistent with that position.
That's completely understandable. There's unknown risks. So the decision's taken, we're not going to open the hospital. But at that point, there's a pause. You're not opening the hospital. So you're not up against that critical time barrier. So before deciding whether this public money is going to be spent bringing the system from 4 up to 10, why not undertake a risk assessment at that point?
So I don't think it's realistic to say that the Cabinet Secretary obviously made a public kind of communication saying there's an issue with the ventilation. We're going to deliver, we're going to find solutions to deliver 10-year changes. I don't think it would be, I suppose, realistic to kind of come back and say, well, we've actually considered the position and 4 is good enough. I don't think the Cabinet Secretary would have been comfortable with that. And so it was not a position that we particularly kind of explored in any detail.
But do you understand why was the public announcement made, we'll definitely bring it up to standard? Because I can understand once that's been said, that's what the public would expect. But why wasn't the messaging simply, we don't know if the hospital is safe and we're investigating that, then investigate whether 4 is safe as opposed to 10 and then make the decision? Why does that snap decision have to be made of, we're not opening the hospital and we definitely have to spend all this public money bringing it up to 10-year changes per hour? So that was not part of our kind of consideration, but I suppose that the thinking about this now, it would undermine our guidance. So if we're saying that actually the guidance that we produce, that we can change it whenever and it would be presented as whenever it's inconvenient for us, that we can just change our guidance. I just don't think that would have been. I don't think anyone or many people would have been happy with that, even if we had gone to that effort to undertake a risk assessment and say, actually, we've got specialists that say this is fine. I just don't think that would have landed. And that's despite the fact that within the wider NHS estate, there's lots of hospitals like Sheen's that don't have any mechanical ventilation, but are deemed safe. Simply, if the guidance says these parameters must be met for a new build hospital, they must be met in all cases.
So where there's a difference in hospitals that are delivering healthcare, there is obviously a whole process of review and consideration as to what is actually happening in these hospitals. So it's not just the air changes makes it safe, it's the fact that there are infection control teams monitoring what's happening, reviewing any infection that is found in the hospital. There's a well-established escalation process for when infections have to be reported to the Scottish Government, to the Chief Nursing Officer. And so that whole process gives us the confidence that the hospital is safe. It's not just the ventilation is just, or lack of ventilation is just one part of that.
Thank you. If I could just ask you, just for completeness, Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 41, just the final 3 lines. states, however, if we cannot get a satisfactory answer to this question within the next 24 hours, our preference would be to delay until such time as we do have a satisfactory answer. So that's effectively, is the hospital safe?
Yes.
That's NHS Lothian telling the Scottish Government, if we can't really get to the bottom of this, we don't think it's going to be safe to open the hospital. Is that right?
Yes.
And is this really a consensus view that there's not any massive split between NHS Lothian on the one side and Scottish Government on the other? Really, everyone at this point is saying, if we don't know the hospital's safe, we can't open it.
So as I don't recall anyone advocating for opening the hospital and saying that the position was good enough.
Thank you. And if we could just look on Bundle 7, Volume 1, if we look on to page 42, you see that towards the bottom of that page, there's an email from Edward McLaughlin on the 3rd of July. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we just look over the page, we then see a recording of a meeting that takes place. There's a number of attendees, including yourself, as we'll see when we get to the bottom, but it's recording a meeting that takes place on the 3rd of July between NHS Lothian personnel and individuals from Scottish Government. You see that the first bullet point, major concerns raised about the risk of doing the permanent solution with patients in situ. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is that everyone at the meeting saying that would be a big problem and a big risk that we need to address?
Absolutely.
Then if we look 3 bullet points down, you see it states need to be convinced that proposed permanent solution is deliverable. Do you see that?
Yep.
Again, Mr Davidson, when he gave evidence, he said really there was no suggestion that there was ever going to be any option other than ultimate compliance with SHTM 0301. So some of the discussions we've been having about why risk assessed matters, his view was very much it never entered NHS Lothian's ether that there would be anything other than full compliance. So if we're talking about interim solutions, we're talking about interim solutions before the ventilation system was brought up to compliance with SHTM 0301. Is that your understanding of the discussions?
Yeah, very much so.
Then if we look towards the bottom of the main bullet points, you'll see there's a paragraph, safer for patients to stay put. Do you see that?
Yep.
Safer for patients to stay put, contingency required if permanent solution doesn't work. Do you see that? So again, is the consensus view at this meeting of there are known risks with both the hospital at Sheens and also the old Department for Clinical Neurosciences, that can be managed and you can't simply open the hospital and take risks with patients?
Yes.
And then you'll see that there's a heading just below that, unknowns. Do you see that? So unknowns, the safety implications of running the facility with 4 air changes rather than 10. Do you see that?
Yes.
So by the 3rd, this is still an unknown risk.
Yes.
Then if we look down, you see that there's a heading, consensus view. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
It states, given the information available, the consensus was that with unknown risks associated with moving patients and then modifying the ventilation of the building, combined with the believed safe environment of the current facility, the safety of patients might be better served by delaying the move and modifying the ventilation of the new building before moving patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then we see everyone who attends the meeting listed on this page and over the page, and that meeting includes yourself. So should the inquiry understand that in the period whenever this issue is escalated in second right through to the 3rd, there seems to be a consensus view amongst both NHS Lothian and Scottish Government in relation to the fact that the hospital probably can't open and that any remedial works need to be done before the hospital is open.
Yes.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look on, please, Bundle 7, Volume 1 at page 57. It's Bundle 7, Volume 1, page 57. This is a meeting of a minute of a different meeting that takes place on the 3rd of July, this time at 2 p.m. You were listed as an attendee at this meeting as well. There's obviously a lot of meetings going on. We've looked at a draft email with a set of minutes from one meeting. There's this later meeting taking place. Do you have any recollection that the minute we're looking at here, what was being discussed at this meeting?
So, yes, I remember the meeting. The detail, I'm not quite as it's not quite as clear as other meetings. I was a bit more of a passive participant in this meeting. That from memory, that it was primarily Tim Davison and John Conahan that were leading on what do we do, what are the solutions, and you can see from the note that John was thinking about, you know, temporary solutions that could be deployed, and John's got a lot of experience in that area, and so I was mainly listening.
And again, in terms of the discussions that are taking place, is there any major disagreements that you remember between Scottish Government on the one hand and NHS Lothian on the other?
I don't know.
The Cabinet Secretary then takes her decision on the 4th of July that the hospital won't open, is that right?
Yes.
And were you involved in any discussions with the Cabinet Secretary in relation to why she took that decision, or is that an independent decision made by the Cabinet Secretary?
So at that point, the Cabinet Secretary was meeting with our senior officials, and primarily she was relying on the Director General and the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Nursing Officer or deputies or whoever was attending for them. And in addition, I was there, I suppose, relaying the assessment of the situation from HFS and HPS. And so she considered the position. To be honest, it was, I think she found it a relatively straightforward decision because she couldn't give the assurances about the new hospital being safe. She didn't get any, nobody pushed back and said we think that was the wrong thing to do, either from a clinical or technical point of view. And that was it was agreed, from my memory, relatively quickly, recognising that it was obviously a very difficult situation we were in, but the decision itself was not difficult.
Okay. Were you involved in the process of communicating the Cabinet Secretary's decision to NHS Lothian, or did others to do with that? The reason I ask is Mr Davison's position is he says that he wasn't given any advance notice. Nobody from Scottish Government picked up the phone and told him the decision had been made. He simply found out about it in a press release. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that he said that. I mean, I think for for that level of for a decision of that importance, it would be either Malcolm Wright or John Conahan that would be the conduit from Scottish Government to the Chief Executive.
Okay. So in terms of the direct communication, in terms of whether Mr Davison was told, what he was told, when he was told, that would be John Conahan, Malcolm Wright that would deal with that, as opposed to yourself?
Yeah, I don't recall speaking to Tim directly on this. I was obviously part of kind of conversations and wider meetings, but I didn't have any one-to-one conversations with him.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, Volume 1, please, page 84, which is an email that you send on the 5th of July. So this is the day after the Cabinet Secretary's made her decision. And you say, John Shirley, removing ministers and SPADs from the CC list, my thoughts on the questions which I think sit with me. And then you'll see 2, confirmation HFS/HPS assurance work has begun and a timescale for completion. Do you see that?
Yep.
So what did this paragraph relate to?
So I think this would be in terms of that wider question. If one major system was non-compliant, how can we have assurance that other major systems beyond just ventilation were compliant? So I think quite early on, we realised that we need a kind of overarching review of the whole project and from a technical compliance point of view.
And then if you look down within the email, you see section 8, which says update on work, re-audit, stroke investigation and timescale. You say, in my mind, the audit of the governance arrangements would be best undertaken by one of the accountancy firms. So it seems like there's a decision that we need to have an audit done of governance arrangements. Why was that decision taken?
we needed to understand what had happened, what had gone wrong, and that the audit firms have obviously kind of a lot of experience in that area, and just to basically improve our understanding what went wrong and what we needed to do to not repeat the same mistakes.
Thank you. And then if we look to section 9, it says confirmation that all current build elsewhere involves HFS now. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you say, on the call yesterday, I mentioned to HFS/HPS that they should assume that we will ask for them to validate all new builds, and so they should create a template which can be used for other projects. However, I think it would be disingenuous to suggest that all new builds now involve HFS, if for no other reason the HFS don't have that many engineers that they can deploy. So I think it is better to say that they will involve HFS. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Could you just perhaps explain to the inquiry, why weren't you able at this stage to say, for all projects, we're going to simply get HFS to go in and do validation works?
There was resource restrictions on Health Facilities Scotland. Clearly what was happening in Edinburgh was going to take up a lot of their time and resource. That in addition to the support they were providing in Glasgow at the Queen Elizabeth, that it was just a recognition that we would clearly be prioritising the work in Edinburgh over the immediate kind of future, and that any kind of subsequent follow-up with places like Orkney or in Dumfries, the new hospitals that had been built, would inevitably be on the back burner, simply because there's no indication that there were any problems or significant issues with these new builds.
And you mentioned there, you say HFS don't have that many engineers. What was your recollection of the resourcing and how many engineers HFS had as at 5th July?
Well, I think, as I said earlier before lunch, that I was aware of some engineers, but in terms of the undertaking quite a significant programme of work that we were proposing, that kind of spare resource was not there. So it was just really to kind of put on the radar that if we're going to undertake this, then more resource would be required, and it would need to be technically, qualified resource to give us the assurance that we'd be requiring.
Thank you. KPMG come in, they provide their report. It's available at Bundle 13, Volume 3, at page 1153. What was the findings from the KPMG report?
So I think that they kind of, in some respects, that they kind of recognised that NHS Lothian's governance arrangements were broadly okay, notwithstanding what had happened. I think they looked into the failure, and I think that I can't remember the exact phase, but I think they suggested it was a systematic kind of failure to identify the problems. So it was a helpful report just to understand what had gone wrong, because I think at that point we were still trying to. I think within the first few days there'd been a suggestion as to how the mistake had happened. But having that independent confirmation that there was an issue with the environmental matrix was helpful.
One of the things KPMG identified, possible problems with an error in a spreadsheet and environmental matrix. Did it surprise you that an issue like that, despite all the stages of governance that take place, that there wasn't any mechanism to spot that type of problem?
So I think, having seen the environmental matrix, it's obviously a very in-depth and complicated document. I suppose it depends when you say governance, that in terms of, for instance, the regular project meetings that would have been that occurred, I wouldn't necessarily have thought that group would review an environmental matrix. I suppose we're slightly surprised that from the technical side of things, when you're going through the technical specification, somebody didn't kind of either realise or recognise that 4-year changes is not is not what the standard requires. But I suppose I should add that this is speculation. I don't know what how you review an environmental matrix, but it just seemed that that surprising that somebody didn't notice.
If we could look within the KPMG report to page 1168, please. You see letter D there, do you see that? It states, the governance processes and procedures surrounding the construction and commissioning of the hospital operated in line with the structure that was put in place. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So as I read the KPMG report, they were effectively saying that the structure that was put in place by NHS Lothian, there wasn't any structural non-compliance with guidance set out in Scottish Capital Investment Manual, for example. Is that your understanding?
Yes, I mean, looking in, I thought that Lothian's governance structures were entirely appropriate. A key thing for any major capital project is involvement with the executive team. You need their buy-in to drive it forward, and that clearly was evidenced by the senior responsible officer being very close to the issue, as well as our kind of executive colleagues. So from that point of view, it was as I would expect for any project of this scale.
If I could ask you to look to Bundle 7, Volume 3, please, at page 111. This is a briefing prepared by you on the 16th of August 2019. So Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 111.
Thank you.
Briefing to the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, bold heading, Edinburgh Children's Hospital, KPMG draft report. Do you see that?
Yep.
Then if we look to paragraph 6, final sentence, 3 lines up from the bottom, there's a summary of the findings that says, this appears to have stemmed from a document produced by NHS Lothian at the tender stage in 2012, which was inconsistent with SHTM 0301 and which was referred to throughout the project. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we look on to page 113, there's a summary at paragraph 22, which states the main issue contained in the report is that a mistake included in the tender documentation was not picked up at any stage over the next 7 years, despite the fact that there was appropriate professional and technical involvement in the project and that the governance arrangements operated as planned. The other issue of focus is that because the report provides a comprehensive summary of each issue that this project has had to deal with, it brings attention to the unusually high number of problems which this project has experienced, and we may be asked why we did not intervene earlier. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why didn't the Scottish Government intervene earlier?
Because at that point that we thought that Lothian's technical advisors and their project team were able to deal with them.
There's another series of questions set out at paragraph 23 in the bullet points. Do you see those?
Yes.
So one of the questions is, why was the contract signed in February 2015 before the design was complete? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Did you get to the bottom of that? Why was the contract signed before the design was complete?
No, we didn't pursue that kind of question.
Okay. The next bullet point is, why was the practical completion certificate signed in February 2019 while there remained a large number of issues that needed to be resolved? Why was that done?
There was an assumption that when the hospital was handed over, that it was felt by the Lothian team that they could address these issues during the commissioning phase prior to the hospital opening.
Okay. And is that perhaps back to what we discussed earlier about, I think what you accepted were problems in governance on the part of Scottish Government, that there was simply assumptions being made when the £10 million was handed over and the new procedures simply wouldn't allow that to happen?
So I think in specifically to that point that we were aware that in normal circumstances you would address all technical issues before the commissioning started. But when the hospital was almost 2 years late at that point, that there was a keenness to get the hospital open as soon as possible. And so that dealing with the issues at the same time as the commissioning was considered a risk worth taking.
So just want to be clear, is that a known risk on the part of Scottish Government, or is this something that you're telling us about with the benefit of hindsight?
No, so I seem to recall there was a briefing that I provided to the Cabinet Secretary that acknowledged that this is there's a risk, because at February 2019, obviously we weren't aware that the ventilation issue that stopped the move was out there. It was more there's a number of technical issues that we think we can resolve. Some of them will lead into the overlap with the commissioning period, but the hospital opening in summer 2019 was still considered deliverable.
So is that known non-compliance with stage 4 high scribe on the part of Scottish Government?
No, so it's not specifically in terms of the high scribe kind of processes. It's more the issues that the settlement agreement was there to address.
Thank you. If we could just return to Bundle 7, Volume 3, page 113, the second last bullet point. It says, why are we paying a monthly charge for a hospital we can't use? Do you see that? Why was that taking place?
That was the contract. So this was partly, while there's a straightforward answer that the contract dictates that in the public domain, that was clearly going to be a challenge for the Cabinet Secretary to address that point. So it was just to effectively flag it for her awareness that while the answer is straightforward, it's not an answer that is one that she'd be particularly comfortable with.
And then the final question is, how can we have technical guidance on ventilation systems which lacks clarity and is open to interpretation? Do you see that?
Yeah.
That's obviously a technical issue and you might not be able to help with it, but it does seem surprising that there's technical guidance that lacks clarity and is open to interpretation. Did you get an answer to the question, why did that exist?
Not specifically. I mean, there's obviously been kind of reviews of the ventilation kind of guidance. I mean, I do think that again, I suppose it's from a non-technical background. The guidance is complicated, and I'm not sure if it would be difficult not to, or to produce guidance that doesn't have that challenge around some parts of interpretation, because where it's been described to me as guidance doesn't cover every eventuality, and so therefore there's a degree of interpretation that local teams need to take into account when trying to apply it to their particular point.
NHS Lothian, they're escalated to level 3, and then the oversight board's created, and then they're escalated to level 4 thereafter. Are you involved in any of the discussions or the decision making relating to the escalation to level 3 and then to level 4?
Not at all.
Just given your knowledge and involvement with Scottish Government, it seems like up to the point 3rd of July that there's no division between NHS Lothian and Scottish Government. Can you understand the rationale of why, if NHS Lothian has identified that there's a problem, is putting forward solutions and is suggesting that there should be a pause until the fix is done? Can you understand why they had to be escalated to level 3 and then to level 4?
So do I understand why that decision was taken? Yes, I can. I mean, my involvement in the escalation process is literally nil, and it didn't really. It really wasn't on my radar as to how significant that was. If it was to, in terms of what I was working on.
Thank you. If I could ask you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 4, page 426, please. This is a summary of estimated delay costs. Do you see that?
Yep.
And then if we look to the table just under 3.2, we see a breakdown of costs for works at the RHCYP DCN facility, costs of maintaining existing services stroke sites, project team and advisor costs, and then contingency costs. Do you see that? So should the inquiry understand that the forecast costs effectively rectify the problem to bring the ventilation system at the hospital up to compliance with published guidance SHCM 0301? The cost of that is approximately £16.8 million.
Yeah.
If I could ask you to look to Bundle 3, please, page 531. Which is a minute of the Oversight Board dated the 5th of December 2019. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
And if we could look over the page, please, onto page 532. And it's the first bullet point beginning the NHSL Board. Do you see that?
Yep.
So it states, the NHSL Board had taken their governance responsibility seriously and whilst not happy about the current situation, realised that this was the only option available to progress the opening of the hospital. The Board reluctantly agreed the proposal. The NHSL Board had requested Oversight Board approval of the decision, which they were agreeing to, as it was appreciated that the NHSL Board would be signing the public sector up to unknown financial risks, and currently no programme certainty associated with progressing with the proposal. They wished this concern to be made clear to the Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretary, given how the actions of the NHSL Board may be viewed in the future. Do you see that?
Yep.
So this concept that NHS Lothian were concerned that the contracts they're signing into are potentially exposing the public purse to unknown financial risks, is that something that's known to you?
So is this in relation to the overall kind of rectification of the...
This is in relation, I think, to Settlement Agreement 2 and High Value Change Notice 107.
So we would have known that there was some uncertainty, and that you can see from the previous paper you shared that the forecasts change, and that I was comfortable that the estimate that we were working with was good enough for the situation that we were managing. While I can acknowledge that, not knowing fully the financial risks, the priority for us was getting the hospital open as soon as possible. And if that meant moving ahead with some uncertainty on the costs, I was okay with that, because we had a reasonable idea in the broad parameters of the budget that we manage.
Thank you. And just within your statement, really covering off your involvement in the project, you mentioned it at paragraph 66 that you believe from your involvement in the project that the new hospital is now one of the safest healthcare buildings in the country, perhaps Europe. Can you just explain, obviously, as someone who's worked in the project, albeit on the financial side, why did you feel able to make that statement?
I mean, in simple terms, new hospitals are better than old hospitals, and that in terms of where I'm particularly focused is on either the new hospitals or the hospitals with challenges like the previous sick children's hospital. So knowing what I know from our entire, across the entire hospital estate, it seems pretty clear to me that our new facilities are fantastic, to be blunt about it.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on and look at the other statement that you provided to inquiries. That's the first statement in the chronology, which details your involvement in the creation of the new Centre for Excellence, NHS Scotland Assure. You tell the inquiry at paragraph 7 of your statement that you sat on the NHS Scotland Assure Design Reference Group. Can you just explain what was that and what was it tasked with doing?
So the reference group was essentially the governance meeting that considered how we took the idea of we need something to address the issues that we're managing and turn that into a viable proposition. So it was led by NSS as they were ultimately going to host NHS Assure, but it also included, as well as other colleagues from Scottish Government, a fairly wide representative of members from across boards, both with a kind of estates technical background as well as infection control as well.
Okay. And you tell us within the statement, really the whole rationale for the creation of the group was as a result of concerns over the effectiveness of the build assurance process for new build hospitals.
Yes.
If I can ask you to look to the target operating model for the new Centre of Excellence, that's in bundle 9, page 4, please. So bundle 9, page 4. Is this a document that you've seen before?
Yes.
And for those of us that weren't involved in the process, why was this document created? What's the target operating model?
So this was NSS's, I think this was prepared round about March 2020. It was their first, I suppose, kind of formal presentation on answering the question that we'd set them in terms of what we were looking for.
And if we could look on to page 12, please. You see that there's a bold heading there, our research. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says the user research sought to understand users' experience, pain points of managing risk in the healthcare built environment, and what they want and need from the QHBE. And then you'll see that there's key themes that emerge. Data from user research activity was synthesised and aggregated into 14 themes. Do you see that? And then if we look down, approximately halfway down the page, we'll see that skills and training is one issue, having experts available at the right points in the process, i.e. IPC, estates and executives, national and local procurement, guidance, change control and governance. You see that? And then it says at the very bottom that the full summary of user research key insights can be found in Appendix A. Mm-hmm. If we look on to Appendix A, if we look to page 59, first of all, you see that at the bottom of that page, more is said in relation to procurement. Do you see that?
Yes.
So it was identified from the research carried out by NSS that current procurement processes are not fit for purpose. Boards do not have ability to check what contractors are delivering, and responsibilities and liabilities need to be reviewed. Do you see that?
Yes.
So having identified procurement as a problem, the procurement process not being fit for purpose, what if anything, did the Scottish Government do in response?
So from the procurement process, I've not fully understood what I'm not aware of problems with our kind of procurement processes, and I've spoken to a number of people about their experience, and I don't have anything to add to address that statement. Because from my perspective, it's not a problem I would recognise. Okay.
So as far as you're concerned, it might not fall under your remit, but there's an identified problem with procurement and you're not aware of any steps taken to address that identified problem?
Well, I'm not aware of what the problems that have been identified. Within a different part of NSS, there's framework agreements for capital projects that are set up and managed to help deliver any kind of healthcare builds that we have. And they would be best placed to kind of comment on the specifics of what they do. But as I say, I'm not aware of what that particular statement refers to.
So whenever you were involved in the NHS Scotland Assure Design Reference Group, should the inquiry understand that potential problems with procurement, they're not being discussed in that group.
No, not to my recollection anyway.
Thank you. And then if I can ask you to look over the page onto page 60, this is still within the user research. You see that there's a reference to guidance there. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says guidance needs more teeth. Guidance needs to be clarified, and when it's applicable in full or where appropriate, there needs to be support on how to translate guidance in practice. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did you have an understanding whenever you were sitting in the NHS Scotland Assure Design Reference Group that there was a perception that the guidance needed more teeth?
So it wasn't framed in that way to me. I think that what was recognised was guidance was complicated and difficult to apply and interpret correctly and consistently. So I think one of the kind of key changes with NHS Assure is to give that more kind of central support on what is required in guidance and address any issues or confusions or ambiguities that a local team might have.
Does that not suggest, though, if the guidance needed more teeth, that it really needed to stop being guidance and be made into a hard-edged legal standard where compliance was mandatory?
So, I mean, I think that is, I suppose, an interesting question, because what does that mean in reality? Because does that effectively mean that if a healthcare facility doesn't comply with guidance, then what? And that's where I think that you need to kind of step back and look at the wider system of control and review that is in place, because if, for example, there's a ventilation system that is not delivering the number of air changes required, but that ward has not had an infection for 5 years, then what do we do in that situation? Because one of the big challenges that we have with our estate is if we need to upgrade a facility, where do we put people? So decanting patients, we need somewhere to put them. And also that there's while this inquiry is rightly focused on quality in the built care, that affordability is a natural kind of position that we have to take. So if we mandated that guidance need to be improved and emphasised, then that would come from the health budget. So we would inevitably spend less on other things in order to upgrade or address any guidance issues. So I think that the system we have at the moment, provided that we've got that kind of well-established route of reviewing what is the outcomes if there's any infections, then that works at the moment. To go down to a more severe way of managing it would have quite significant consequences.
That's entirely understandable for the old estate. The Cabinet Secretary came and gave evidence to the inquiry yesterday, and she really equated for new build hospitals compliance with the guidance as being the equivalent of safety. That if the standard is there that says it needs to be 10 air changes per hour, her evidence was, well, why would you ever do anything less than that? Was there any consideration given when the new Centre for Excellence was being set up that really what should be implemented is something similar to what you have under the domestic building regulations, that you have a set standard, and for the new build, that is the standard that must be met. Now, if the standards change and improve, you don't have to bring the building up to that standard, but for the new build, there is a hard-edged minimum legal standard as opposed to something lesser than guidance. Was that ever considered? So
the NHS Assure have introduced the key stage assurance review process, the KSAR, and to some extent that is still evolving over time. It's just been there's only a relatively small number of projects that have kind of gone through it, and I think that probably kind of it kind of balances the requirements to comply with guidance with I suppose that still the practicalities of delivering, a compliant building that is on time and as far as possible on budget. So I think that where if there was an issue that the local team in discussion with NHS Assure kind of said this is the proposal that we have is good enough, then I think that flexibility, retaining that would be quite important.
In terms of the model for NHS Scotland Assure, the target operating model makes very clear that it's not innovating in terms of where the legal liabilities would lie. Those would still lie with the Health Board as opposed to lying with the Centre for Excellence. It's also made very clear that the new Centre for Excellence is not going to be an inspector and it's not going to have a regulatory function. Is that correct?
Yes. Now,
the former Cabinet Secretary, her vision for the new Centre for Excellence is that it would be akin to a clerk of works, that it would be a body whereby individuals would go in. According to her witness statement, they would be pushing buttons, pulling levers, they'd be doing physical testing and inspection. Why did the Centre of Excellence not adopt that approach of having individuals that were going in and doing physical testing and inspection?
So my understanding is that there was a period of time where clerk of works were perhaps phased out. But I think that for most healthcare projects I'm aware of, there are clerks of works that are undertaking that kind of review that you kind of spoke of. So what NHS Assure is trying to do is provide additionality and support to the Health Board and not duplicate what they're already doing. So I think that what the Cabinet Secretary's kind of vision of somebody kind of checking that everything works. It's my understanding, at least, that does happen. It's just not done by NHS Assure.
Thank you. Another issue that I'd like to ask you about is whether or not at the minute there's overlap or duplication in procedures. You obviously, given your role on the Capital Investment Group, be familiar with the stages that need to be gone through before finance will be provided. A number of individuals have given evidence about issues that they think arise at the minute in terms of duplication. So Mr Greer, who used to work for Mott MacDonald, now works for NHS Lothian, he gave the example of having the Key Stage Assurance Review, the KSAR, sitting alongside the NDAP procedure. Do you see those procedures as being different, complementary, or are they largely duplication?
So my preference is NHS Assure have one process that all projects have to go through, and where, to be honest, I would prefer NDAP was absorbed into the KSAR process. I think that would make it more straightforward. That it's obviously for NHS Assure to decide that. I think that's ultimately where they'll get to, but they've not made that change yet.
So from your perspective, there are these processes that are similar but different, but certainly from your perspective, you think there would be a benefit in a streamlining so that there was only one procedure that had to be gone through? Yeah,
well, and I think that the NDAP is different from KSAR. One of the early questions I asked, back in July 2019 was, would NDAP be expected to identify the problem with the ventilation? And I think the answer was probably not. Whereas the KSAR, I absolutely would expect the new process to identify any issues that caused the delay at the Edinburgh Children's Hospital. That doesn't invalidate the value of a design review and consideration on some of the more kind of holistic parts of a healthcare project. But to me, it would make sense if it was one thing that a board had to go through.
Thank you. The inquiry's heard evidence in relation to challenges that exist in terms of recruiting individuals with the right skills in this area? So in particular, engineers that have experience in the built environment and infection prevention and control professionals. When you were involved in setting up the new Centre for Excellence, were those challenges at the forefront of your mind?
Yes, certainly. I was less familiar with the infection control side of things, but I know that engineers are that the NHS is competing with the private sector for good engineers, and that there was always a risk that we could potentially lose out to private sector that pays better. So I think that there was where we have, or NHS Assure, my understanding is that they've quite significantly increased their workforce. I think engineers are a part of that. And also part of what they're looking at is working in conjunction with NHS Education, having that kind of, if you like, a pipeline of young people kind of getting into the profession, and then ultimately, kind of becoming qualified over time with experience. I think that there'll be an ongoing challenge with that the workforce challenge in the health service is not restricted to infection control and engineers. It's pretty widespread. But I think the what NHS Education are doing in conjunction with NHS Assure, and I think of what the current Chief Nursing Officer outlined in his evidence to you about what they are doing in terms of skills and recognition of where nurses' professional development might need to evolve and change is a way we address that risk.
Thank you. You mentioned within your statement that you think NHS Scotland Assure, the key stage assurance review process, is an improvement on what went before, and you consider that it's a proportionate response to the problems that arose on the Royal Hospital for Children and the Department of Clinical Neurosciences. Is that
Yes.
correct? The former Cabinet Secretary gave evidence yesterday, and she indicated that she thought that the new Centre for Excellence was an improvement, but she didn't think necessarily that it was a complete answer to all of the problems that exist in this space. She thought there might have to be further consideration given to whether the Scottish Government really needs to be more involved in these new build projects. What's your own view? Is NHS Scotland Assure, is it enough, or does more need to be done to address the issues?
So I'm comfortable with the direction of travel at the moment. I think that while NHS Assure is part of NSS, I do see it as an extension of Scottish Government. They work closely with my team, and that if I had any particular issue that I wanted them to look at, if there's a particular project that needed a bit more support or input, then they would respond positively to that. But to be honest, that we're not taking forward many capital projects at the moment, and so therefore that small number is allowed that the Assure team to pretty much support everyone that is in progress at the moment. And the complexities of the health build are not they're not kind of reducing. And so even with that additional support, there's still challenges, there's still issues that we need to work locally with, or work with the local teams. And I suppose that idea that everything will now be delivered on time and on budget is, while it's a worthy aspiration, that the reality is there's still going to be issues, hopefully not as significant as Edinburgh Children's Hospital, but there's still some things we need to work through.
Thank you. Within your statement, you addressed the Grant Thornton report, which was instructed by NHS Lothian, which you'll no doubt have become familiar with, even if you weren't at the time it was issued. You make the point, though, that was a report instructed by a health board for a health board, and that you're not aware of any formalised structure whereby that would be shared more widely within the NHS. Is that correct?
Correct.
It might seem surprising to a layperson that you have public money being used for a report for a public body, but there's not any formalised structures for that learning to be shared. So NHS Lothian gets the report, it gets the benefit of the learning that comes out of that. but there's not a structured forum for that to be shared with other health boards. Why isn't there that structured process?
So I would say that the issues at the Edinburgh Children's Hospital were certainly discussed at the Strategic Facilities Group. So this is the group that effectively directors of estates meet. It's managed by and led by NHS Assure, and I sit in that group as well. So we certainly discussed the issues at the Edinburgh Children's Hospital. In terms of the governance points, it would probably be that the conversations at SFG were more focused on the technical side of things. And I suppose that where you're right, that because it was a locally commissioned report, that we felt that putting that out to the service and say be aware of that wasn't appropriate. I'd contrast that with the independent review at the Queen Elizabeth that was undertaken by Doctors kind of Fraser and Montgomery, that we thought there was kind of wider lessons. They wrote that review to for that wider audience, and so we distributed that to chief execs. And then as part of the capital investment group, a standard question will be, have you taken into account the recommendations from the Queen Elizabeth Independent Review? So I think that that learning is still there, and that kind of consideration of what we've learned is within the service.
The final question from me at the moment, Mr Morrison, really is an open question. One of the issues that the Chair requires to consider is how could these projects potentially be done better in the future? You cover some of that within your statement. We've covered some things today. But is there anything we've not covered that you think it would be important to raise in terms of how the problems with the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People and the Department for Clinical Neurosciences, how those types of problems could be avoided on future projects?
So I would like to think that the introduction of NHS Assure is a fairly significant way of addressing the problems that we quickly identified were there. Assure is much bigger and more extensive than Health Facilities Scotland. It is the very nature of these projects are complicated, and I'm sure. I believe you're taking evidence from the director tomorrow that she'll kind of reflect on things that have changed even in the 3-4 years that Assure have been in operation, and we are continually kind of considering and reviewing what our learnings from ongoing projects and how we can apply them more generally. So I think that kind of awareness is there. And I suppose also that in the past that there was, I think, more flexibility given locally to the project director to make kind of decisions that might impact on timeline or budget as well as quality. And we've definitely moved to a point where for new build, quality is the main driving factor. But as we do that, then inevitably then some projects will be more expensive. They will take a wee bit longer to deliver because we will need to deliver what the local team, the infection control specialists, NHS Assure agree is the best way forward.
Thank you, Mr Morrison. Thank you for answering my questions today. I don't have any further questions at the moment. Lord Brodie may have questions, or there may be applications from core participants. Thank you.
Mr Morrison, just I think two matters of small detail. You were asked not long ago by Mr McGregor about a sharing learning, and that came from consideration of the Grant Thornton report. And you mentioned the issues with the Children's Hospital were certainly discussed at the strategic facilities, and I didn't get the last group.
SFG.
Right, and is that a standing group?
Yes, so this is a group that, so the director of NHS Assure chairs the group. The invitation is to each director of estates at NHS board or the equivalent post, which considers matters relating to facilities and estates. There are a number, there's 4 subgroups that report into that. CTAG is perhaps one that you're familiar with, that oversees any changes to the ventilation guidance, and that's the forum for these issues to be aired.
And the other question related to your understanding of how Key Stage Review is working as administered by NHS Scotland Assure. Now, I appreciate that you may not be the best person to ask, but I think you did touch on it in your evidence. Do you understand that the Key Stage Review is an opportunity for Assure to, well, I put it in my note, this is not what you said, adjusting the guidance. In other words, I think this came from Mr. McGregor's question about teeth. Now, I just really want to understand what your understanding is about how guidance is, I don't know if what the word is, applied, moderated, modified, so through Assure at the Key Stage Review.
So one of the interesting things is that the understanding of risks around infection over the last few years has changed quite dramatically. But guidance doesn't get updated as frequently as our understanding. So I know that the one big capital project in NHS Scotland at the moment is up in Aberdeen. And it's clear that there's a communication between colleagues in Grampian and Greater Glasgow and Clyde about the learnings of the Queen Elizabeth. And so there's actually there's situations where the clinical understanding of what is best is in fact in excess of what the guidance stipulates. And so in these kind of situations, that there is a kind of conversation involving the local IPC team, NHS Assure, about what should be done next. And in all cases, what we're looking for is a consensus to be reached, because there are it's complicated and it's not always black and white, but provided that the appropriate people are making a determination on what is the best way forward, then that would be satisfactory from a KSAR point of view.
Right, and the Key Stage Review is the opportunity for that.
Yes, so that is happening kind of all the time. There are some key points that a KSAR must be signed off. There's pretty much each stage of the business case process, and then once the project is in construction, there is a KSAR for construction and then ultimately commissioning. And one of the things that we introduced, I think it was last year, we wrote to chief executives and made clear that a new building will not or cannot open until you have an approved KSAR signed off by NHS Assure.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Now, as Mr. McGregor indicated, I want to take the opportunity to check with the room whether there's any further questions Mr. McGregor might raise with you. So we'll take a break of about 10 or 15 minutes, and if I could ask you to return to the witness room. Mr Morrison, there are no further questions, and that means you're free to go. But before leaving, can I just say thank you on behalf of the inquiry for your attendance, but also for the work that went into framing your witness statements. I appreciate that that will have been significant. So thank you very much, but you're free to go.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr McGregor, we're able to resume tomorrow with...
Yes, Lord, it is. The witnesses are Critchley and Rogers, and it'll be Mr McClelland asking the questions tomorrow.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for your attendance here today, and we'll see each other, all being well, tomorrow. Thank you.